Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our latest public lecture from the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy, and also part of our series on dismantling the rule of law, that we've been running over the last year. We are incredibly fortunate to have with us today Professor Lane Scheppele, who has probably far too many distinctions to list, so I'm not going to try today. But before I do also want to mention that one of those distinctions is as a wonderful colleague and mentor to many of us at the Graduate Institute, some of whom are here, one or two of whom unfortunately can't be, including Shalini and Gregoire. But I think it's just important to lay a note of recognition in that regard before moving on to the laurels and laureates. So Professor Scheppele is the Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, as well as at the University Centre for Human Values, and has held tenure at the Political Science Departments at Michigan, was the founding director of the Gender Program at Central European University in Budapest, and then, rather remarkably, held simultaneous professorships in law, political science, and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where she taught for a decade. And after moving to Princeton, she directed the program in Law and Public Affairs for a decade and has held visiting faculty positions at the law schools at Michigan, Yale, Harvard, Erasmus Rotterdam, and Humboldt in Berlin. And it's also in that spirit of strong interdisciplinarity that we are, for I think obvious reasons at the Albert Hirschman Centre, very excited to welcome her here. Professor Scheppele's work focuses on the intersection of constitutional and international law, which we'll be hearing a fair amount about today. And this is in particular in constitutional systems under stress, beginning to a great degree after 1989, where she studied the emergence of constitutional law in Hungary and Russia, living in both places for extended periods. After 9/11, her gaze turned to the effects of the international war on terror on constitutional protections around the world, including in the US. And since 2010 has been documenting, and you can sense a thread here, the rise of autocratic legalism, first in Hungary and then in Poland, within the European Union, and it's spread around the world. She is, as I said, a recipient of many honors. I'll mention a couple: an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the International Academy of Comparative Law. In 2014, she received the Law and Society Association's Calvin Prize for Influential Scholarship, and is a member of the Executive Committee of the International Association of Constitutional Law, elected as a global jurist, and from 2017 to 19, she was elected president of the Law and Society Association. Her publications are similarly varied, numerous, and influential across social science journals, law journals, and in many different languages. And the one we're going to hear about today is a forthcoming book next year on, or it's a summary of the arguments in a forthcoming book next year on the life and death of constitutions, where I think we'll be hearing something about the place of constitutions in democracies today, where we're seeing many different claims about what democracy is, and claims that aren't just made but operationalized and institutionalized. So there's a very important question about how constitutions fit in that process of operationalization and institutionalization, and the promises and pitfalls of constitutions as a democratic technology more broadly. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Great. Well, I'm honored to be here, and to particularly say one of the things I love about this place is that you guys keep hiring my students. So I was on Duvall's committee at Harvard Law School, and then I was on Gregoire's committee at Princeton, and I have more students anyway, but I'm really delighted that you have two of mine here on the faculty. And I'm also delighted to see a number of familiar faces in the audience. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And what I decided to do in the course of thinking about how to frame a lecture was to go quickly over a whole book rather than in depth in any one chapter, which means if you ask me questions, you're likely to get a lot more evidence than I can present here. But what I've been trying to do is to sort of make sense out of this crisis that keeps coming up, that everyone wants to talk about, that there are now 1 million books on, the so-called democratic crisis. If you walk into a bookstore, this is the kind of thing you see, which is to say there aren't a lot of people writing happy books about governance these days. So why has there been such an outpouring of books? Well, one of the immediate causes was, of course, the election of Donald Trump. This explains a lot of the literature in English, but as I will say, this is really obviously not new with the United States. But that was what caused a lot of Americans to start writing about this. This is really, however, a global phenomenon. And so what I want to really address today is this question of whether there is a global crisis, a sort of global crisis in democracy, and to what extent that crisis, if it exists, is a crisis of constitutional democracy. Sort of what's happening to domestic constitutions around the world as the various assaults written about in a lot of the books I just showed you are considered. And is there something in common going on across all of these very different national spaces? So let me start by giving you some of the evidence that's often presented on the democratic crisis. So this is the long view, a couple centuries. You can imagine the coding that went into this is not very precise, but at least it tells you something about the general picture of what kinds of governments exist in the world. Obviously, democracies are not very common until the 20th century, and you see this big bump after the First World War, and this rise, of course, especially after 1989 and the end of the Cold War. Green is on the right, it's on both axes, no, it's the percentage of people living in these different kinds of regimes. What you see here is also the end of colonialism, at least formally so called, and also a shifting among different kinds of authoritarianisms or different kinds of non-democratic governments from sort of complete authoritarianism to what's called closed democracy, which is a kind of mixed or hybrid system, and then sort of to the present day. So everyone had gotten used to democracy constantly going up. It's like what they always tell you about stock markets. You can deal with the bumps because the general trend is up. All right, so now is it? Well, in the last 10 years especially, a number of democracy monitors have been noticing that the number of robust democracies is going down. So this is Freedom House's. They change their pictures every year. This is the 2019 picture. And the thing to notice here are the bars in green, which tells you what percentage of governments they rank, which they try to rank everything. What percentage count as free countries, which is not quite the same thing as a democratic government. Democratic governments are typically free, but not all free governments are full-blown democracies, so there's a bit of a conceptual gap. But still, Freedom House has been sounding the alarm that for the last 10 years, the number of free countries has gone down. And what you can see also is that the number or the overall percentage of not free governments is going up. And even though it's it could be over the long run just a small blip, it's something that when you look at the concrete countries involved, it may not be exactly what you would expect. And this tells you a little bit about which countries are getting into trouble. Now, this is the VDEM data set for the political scientists in the room. And what this shows you on the vertical axis, let's start with the horizontal axis, is a score on on how much of a liberal democracy are you. The horizontal axis is 2007 and the vertical axis is 2017. The reason why this picture, I think, is useful is because any country on the line hasn't changed in that amount of time, right? And all the countries above the line have improved since 2007, and all the countries below the line have decreased. And what's quite striking is that the farther up you get in democracy scores, or these sort of liberal democracy scores, the more you get countries below the line. Now, part of that is because if you're at the top of the score, there's nowhere to go but down, right? But it's also the case that what we're seeing is actually a particular decline in democracies that had been doing well. Or democracies that were sort of in the middle. If you see where all those things are clustered, that's where a lot of the action is. And that was the part that was a surprise to a lot of people who were studying this. And so when you look at particular countries, they're not always the worst countries. This tells you that picture a little bit more. So this is a chart that shows you, and again, we're sort of shifting from one metric to another to another. You're supposed to just look at kind of the general trajectory here. These are various scores, these quality of democracy scores. And this just shows you from 2011 to 2018, the average score of countries that are in the EU and OECD, which is to say the countries that you'd think of as being at the top of the, of the pile in terms of relatively stable democracies, all of these indicators, if you average over all those countries, have been declining. I mean, they're not falling off a cliff, but they're all heading in the wrong direction. So scores on electoral processes, rule of law, media pluralism, civil rights, and political liberties, all of these countries on average are kind of taking a hit, right? So this is, I think, the general sense that's behind this judgment that democracies are in decline, because it's not just the usual suspects. It's actually the democracies that we had thought of as reasonably stable ones. Freedom House this year singled out the United States, and I always love to put in this quotation because, Americans have been lecturing the rest of the world so long, it's actually good to see that, we have to work on ourselves. My favorite sentence in the Freedom House assessment was the United States' closest peers with respect to freedom in the world scores are Belize, Croatia, Greece, Latvia, and Mongolia. Americans don't like that. So the US is obviously also going through this. The UK with Brexit is obviously also going through this kind of turmoil in what their democratic system can sustain. Usually Freedom House every year publishes a graph that shows you how things are as their summary. This year they commissioned a cartoon. And what's quite striking about the cartoon is the sense that democracies are burning. And the countries around the edges, if you want to see, are, and I have to actually put on my glasses to see them too, are Saudi, Russia, Turkey, China, Venezuela, Myanmar, Iran, Hungary, and then, of course, Donald Trump. So again, those are the countries that have never been fully, most of them have not been fully democratic governments with the exception of a couple, so that's why I would disagree with this. But the general view that Freedom House thinks the house is on fire is, I think, what you get from a lot of this democracy literature. So my book starts with that as a symptom and tries to ask, so what is going on here? What is this democratic backsliding about? And what I want to introduce, which is not the typical frame in this literature, is to think about what I call constitutional backsliding as distinct from ideological backsliding. And by constitutional backsliding, I'm interested in what happens when you get a government where what the government does is not just say and do toxic things, but where the new government coming in really attacks the pillars of constitutional democracy, where killing off checks on executive power, capturing the courts, in very many ways, turning what had been a pluralistic checked system of limited power into a position where the executive dominates everything. It's that set of changes that I want to single out. The usual explanation for this democratic backsliding, this is the outline, so this is where I'm going so that you see when I get there. The usual explanation for all of this is that these are democratically elected autocrats, that the people doing this are by and large now elected leaders. And so, of course, the immediate idea is that we should blame the electors, blame the people. And populism is really what you see everywhere as the kind of explanation for that. What I hope to do is show you why I think that's actually unlikely. And then, if that's unlikely, what's doing it? I think the problem is a structural problem. And it has to do with the fact that political parties in most of these advanced democracies showed a sign of collapse first. That in almost all the countries where autocracy has made headway, it's because the political parties fell apart first, and then you get this collapse in constitutional government. And then what is to be done? I'll make some suggestions, most of which are impossible, but if you have better ones, I'm very eager to hear them. All right, so democratic backsliding, what are we actually facing? To do this, I need a little terminology. I don't want to go heavily into definitions, but by democracy, there are lots of different ways to define it. Here, I just want to signal that the kind of concept of democracy I'm using is a relatively thin one, where the people are the source of state authority and leaders are chosen by free and fair elections. Okay? Contrasted with autocracy, where the people can't change their leaders even when there are elections. There may still be elections. In fact, almost every country in the world has elections, and in very many of them, there is no real possibility of changing leaders. So the crucial thing has to do with whether leaders can be displaced by elections. And another characteristic of autocracy here is where power is concentrated in the executive, so that not only can the people not control the rotation of leaders, but the other branches of government can't really check and control the leader either. To this kind of simple conception of democracy and this kind of opposing conception of autocracy, I want to introduce the idea of constitutional government as something like democracy plus, where in addition to the ability to rotate leaders, where the people are the source of state power, there's also limited and checked executive power, majority rule with minority rights, independent checking institutions, and adherence to basic constitutional values. It's that set of things I want to refer to as constitutional government, and it's that set of things that I'm worried is particularly in danger. One of the problems that we, I think, find by looking at this challenge to democracy is that elections go on, there's the kind of trappings of a democratic system, but what's missing is all of this stuff underneath the surface. All right. So, as promised, I think that we should think about democratic backsliding as having two flavors, constitutional backsliding and ideological backsliding. And constitutional backsliding is where these bases of constitutional democracy are being attacked, where power is increasingly concentrated in the executive. I think what most of the literature tends to be about is this other thing, ideological backsliding, where the public believes hateful things out of fear and ignorance, where there might be a weakening of constitutional values, but where you find a kind of public rising up and demanding toxic things, right? And those are actually different, I think, and separable features. Now, the problem is when you do a sort of tour of democratic backsliding, I put up this picture because it'll tell you the cases that I'm looking at in this book that I'm writing, the two forms very often coexist. You know, so you get a figure like Mr. Bolsonaro down here on the lower left, who has said a lot of really toxic things, and what you see is him now trying to attack some of the institutions of state. But these things are not always, not how to put it, I think they're conceptually separable, and oftentimes you get one without the other, and so I think it's just important to say there are two different forms of democratic backsliding. And so let me fill in a little bit more about what I think constitutional backsliding is, because that is what I'm trying to understand here. The first thing to say about this kind of backsliding is that if you never had a democracy or a constitutional democracy in the first place, it's hard to lose it, which is to say constitutional backsliding has to happen in countries that actually had achieved some level of constitutional democracy. And so then the question is how they pull back from that. Constitutional backsliding can happen in the values realm, so where you see attacks on pluralism, toleration, respect for minority rights, civil liberties, human rights, etc. But again, there's this other version, which is less support for limited and checked government. So separation of state and society, checks and balances, other ways of limiting the state. One thing you'll see, like I have a number of these, I don't have time to go into the whole survey, but Pew has done a series of really good surveys on democratic attitudes, which does a pretty good job of separating, how bad is it that immigrants have moved here kinds of questions from a question like this one, which is, do you see the courts as fair? And then they look at support for democracy among the groups that think courts are by and large fair and the groups that think that courts are by and large not fair. And not surprisingly, you see these big gaps kind of opening up between those two groups. Like if you think the courts are fair, right, then you're more satisfied with the way democracy is working. So people can understand that as a structural question, and not enough surveys ask those questions, but some do. So constitutional backsliding is the thing I want to talk about. So now the question is how constitutional governments fail. Like what am I talking about concretely as the kind of measures that happen when constitutional democracies start to collapse? So the good news is that there are many fewer coups in the world. Used to be that if you had a democratic government, the main way you'd lose it is that there would be some attack. There'd be some coup, the military would rise up, there'd be some kind of massive rupture in the system. And there are a number of people, some of whom are listed here, who have said who've documented not only are there fewer coups in the world, but the coups tend to be better ones. So the military will take over and say, I promise you a democratic election in 1 year, which is supposed to legitimate the coup. That's kind of new. So democracy and the appearance of democracy has become so crucial in the world that maintaining that appearance will happen, well, leaders will try to do that in almost every form of government. So the good news is that there are fewer coups, or when there are coups, they tend to be better kinds of coups. They promise democracy. They promise the restoration of some kind of responsive government. But the bad news is that when constitutional democracies start to fail, they're failing in cleverer ways. Because the main toolkit of the new autocrats who come to power in elections is that they use the law to undermine constitutionalism. So it's the constitutional designs of these new autocrats that are leading to the shutdown and limitation on checked power. So it becomes very difficult to assess from the outside, unless you really get into the guts of how these laws work, exactly what's going on, because the outside appearance of these regimes will be, there was an election, the person who was elected came to power and changed the laws, right? Which is how democracy is supposed to work. So everything depends on what the content of those laws is after the election. And what we're seeing, and this is what I'll talk to you a little bit about today, is that these new autocrats increasingly make use of tactics that are hard to attack because they've become very good comparative lawyers. They learn how every other country in the world does something, and then they pick the method of doing the something that some good country does, except in their system, attached to the rest of the constitutional system they've built, it has the opposite effect. So when they're attacked, they say this is just like the law in wherever, or they do things like, as I put up here, pick the worst practices of good states. American-style gerrymandering has now become all the rage all over the world, and when attacked, the people who do it say, well, I had consultants from the U.S. Republican Party. The Democrats do it too, but not as much as the Republicans. So then what could be wrong with this? Anyway, you start to see the point. There's a lot of legal engineering going on that requires a fair amount of sophistication in the training of the people watching it to figure out exactly what's going on. So these new, I call them legalistic autocrats when they do things that way, and this is a summary of a lot of other writing that I've already done. There's a kind of script that you see that many of these folks engage in when they come to power. So they're often, these new autocrats often do win elections on what I call, populist, in quotes, like the quotes will be explained later, populist platforms promising change, promising effectiveness. It's surprising how mundane some of these campaigns are when you look at them. And the first election is very often relatively free and fair, about which more a little bit later. But so there's an election promising change. The new autocrat, well, there's two different patterns here. One is that the new autocrat comes in and immediately rewrites the Constitution. That's Orban and Chavez and Correa in Ecuador and some of the others. There's a second pattern where the new autocrat comes in and tries to actually be nice for a while and then flips. So Putin and Erdogan, it took almost a decade into their regimes before the really bad stuff started happening, and that there were some external shocks that explain that. But going after the Constitution. And what do they do when they go after the Constitution? They try to remove checks on executive power. Simple as that. You just have to say, what's the effect of this on the room for maneuver of the executive? And that will tell you a lot. So what are those steps? Well, one of the first things that these governments typically go after is judicial independence. And this will involve changing the way judges are appointed. It will involve coming up with new criteria for judges that enable them to get rid of some of the judges. There are all kinds of creative methods of court packing, but trying to interfere or changing the disciplinary mechanisms by which judges are fired or disciplined or removed or reassigned. Going after that structure is one of the first things that happens. Attacking the free and pluralistic media is another early step in this process. So again, if you some of these guys get this before they come to power. They have a whole media course that accompanied them into power, but if not, they use a lot of their ability through regulation to crash the media that are opposed to them, often using economic measures. The press get bankrupted rather than coercively closed, for example. But by the end of a relatively short period of time, you find that media pluralism is really limited, and there's a kind of echo chamber that repeats the messages of the government. Attacks on civil society are frequent because, again, you can get opposition that builds to your rule if you allow civil society groups to actively engage in criticism. So attacking civil society by cutting their funds, by regulating their activities, spying on them is another thing, which is enabled if they do point 6, which is ensuring loyalist control, what I call the repressive offices. So prosecutors, police, security services become a special place where these folks want to insert their loyalists to be able to do whatever they're asked to do. Delegitimating the political opposition is something that needs to be done at least before the next election. Not just that the opposition has a bad political program, but that the opposition is illegitimate to begin with, either because it's beholden to foreign forces, because it doesn't have the country's interest at heart, it's unpatriotic, treasonous, etc. And then, again, before the next election, the autocrats rewrite the election laws in order to be able to ensure that they will win the next election. And there's so much election engineering that has been, shall we say, perfected even in relatively good democratic states, that if a government is determined to stay in power, there's almost always an election law for them. So the idea is that by the time of the next election, it is impossible for an electorate to get rid of those folks again. Okay, so that's sort of the script that you see these folks doing. So let me just give you a couple of examples from the judiciary. So it used to be considered a bad thing for a president, a dictator, an autocrat, to capture a court by packing it with new members, right? So that's an pretty obvious ploy. So these ploys have gotten more clever. The new system was pioneered in Turkey in 2010 when the Constitutional Court there suddenly was given a whole new jurisdiction. Who could object? The Constitutional Court, which had previously only heard a limited range of cases that could be brought to them only by a limited range of actors, could suddenly hear garden variety human rights cases brought by individuals, like a German-style constitutional complaint. So if you'd gone all the way through the legal system and you'd exhausted every possible legal stop along the way and your rights were still not vindicated, you, an individual, could take your case to the Constitutional Court of Turkey. Lots of people, myself included, said, wow, finally, isn't this great? And then he was then prime minister, that's another piece of his puzzle, but Prime Minister Erdogan then said, well, I really want to support the Constitutional Court. And because it's going to get thousands of new cases, we need lots of new judges. And the international community literally waved this through, right, by saying, of course you need more judges. Isn't this a great thing you're doing for human rights? And then, of course, he gets to pick the new judges. Everybody thinks this is terrific, and the next thing you know, you have a pretty captured constitutional court. This was so successful that Viktor Orban tried it the next year. And now you start to see this expansion of jurisdiction, piling on new cases, providing the excuse for adding new judges. That's why I'm saying these folks are pretty clever, right? Would you know that was court packing? It doesn't look like it unless you know the details of the case. So what happens with the ordinary courts? So this was something where the Hungarians started it, and then it passed on to other places. So it turns out that all over the place, for all kinds of reasons you can expect, retirement ages are being changed. Usually they're extended. Retirement ages are gotten rid of or they're made longer, and nobody ever thought that was an interference with the independence of the person doing the job. So if retirement ages aren't sacred, and you can raise a retirement age without questioning the independence of the office whose retirement age is now raised, what's the problem with lowering it? Okay, there's all kinds of problems with lowering it, but it's hard. Once you've established that retirement ages are not an essential feature of the job and that you can change it for someone once in office, lowering it requires a slightly different argument. In Hungary, Viktor Orban lowered the judicial retirement age in 2011, and he did it in this very clever way by saying, look, all the people who were older than that, he lowered it from 70 to 62. He said, all the people who were older than that got their law degrees in the communist time, and we're just getting rid of communists. Never mind that they'd been judges for 25 years and done, more or less. I mean, not all the judges were terrific, but that's true almost everywhere. But that was the reason given. Okay, so the EU thought there was something fishy going on, came in and said, we're going to take Hungary to the Court of Justice over this, charged with violating the rules on age discrimination. So it turns out the European Court of Justice expedited case, agreed with this, said it was age discrimination. And then you think about what's the remedy in an age discrimination case, and the answer is you compensate the person discriminated against. It's not usually a remedy that they get their job back. So the Hungarians did it. The ECJ acted, the European Commission and then the ECJ acted very quickly. And the end result was that all the judges got compensation and Viktor Orban got to appoint all of his new judges. And of course, in most European systems, the ordinary judiciary is a civil service type position. So when you get rid of the most senior layer, it might have been, 12% of the ordinary judiciary that was fired, but it was almost 30% of the Supreme Court, more than half of the Court of Appeals, more than half of the court presidents across the country. You got rid of the whole leadership stratum, and Viktor Orban got to appoint all new people. So that was considered such a great idea that Mohamed Morsi did it the next year in Egypt before he was deposed. So the system was never carried out, but there were all these visits between the Hungarian and Egyptian justice ministries as they were working out how to borrow this across from one to the other. And now, of course, in 2018, Poland did the same thing. This time the European Commission got smarter and they actually went to the Court of Justice and said, look, this is a violation of judicial independence. And they got interim measures, which is to say, as the judges were being fired, they got that process stopped, so the judges were still there. So there is some learning going on the part of the European Commission, and on the part of the Court of Justice. But still, when you think about it, it's a sort of an incredibly creative thing to do. And through this, you can actually swap out the entire leadership of the judiciary. I could multiply these examples, but this is the kind of thing I mean. And I want to make 2 points with it. One is that it's pretty technical to explain why it's a problem and so on. Second of all, it moves around from place to place. And third, and this is one of the points I keep trying to make with this, the ideology actually doesn't matter. These are techniques of autocracy that operate within lots of different ideologies. So probably many people in this room will remember in 2015 when all of the refugees started coming from Turkey by way of Greece up through Hungary, and Viktor Orban, Mr. Anti-Migrant, has been saying, he blocked the entrance, and he said, we are preserving Christian Europe. We don't want any of those Muslims here. He makes all these Islamophobic speeches. But look at the pattern of transmission. He gets the way he packs the Constitutional Court from Turkey, and he passes it on to Egypt. This is really not about ideology. This is really about autocrats clubs working together, and the public speeches are sort of window dressing. I think they're not the point. So what we're seeing is this kind of spread of worst practices, that these legalistic autocrats are creating this toolkit. They are often adapted from good democracies, or they're adapted to look good to good Democrats, who don't know the country well enough to understand what's wrong with this. They circulate regardless of ideology, and they are, once they succeed, they are very likely to spread. This is just I have a separate paper on this, but I just wanted to put this up. This is a map accurate as of November 2017. It's changed a bit. But one of the things I've been exploring is the extent to which this is correlated with having lawyers in chief in the key executive positions. In both Hungary and Poland, which are the main 2 cases inside the EU where this has been a problem, literally in Poland, Mr. Kaczynski, who's the guy running things behind the scenes, and President Duda has been his happy conspirator. They both have PhDs in law, and the first prime minister, since they got elected in 2015, also had a law degree. In Hungary, Viktor Orban and his whole circle met in law school. They're all lawyers in every position. And in Russia, which I've also studied, Vladimir Putin was trained in law, Dmitry Medvedev was trained in law, their whole circle are also lawyers. And you see a particular kind of, expert drafting kind of in these places with lawyers. You can see that there are lots of places with lawyers. And in fact, since this map was drawn, Italy now has a lawyer as prime minister. Ukraine now has a lawyer as president. Poland's prime minister is now an economist, which is something else that happens. They can also find lawyers around. But what's sort of interesting to me is how having a law degree doesn't make you committed to the rule of law, right? And so, in fact, it makes you expert at undermining it. All right, so basically what's happening with these kinds of techniques is that you're seeing, this kind of constitutional destruction. I don't know how many of you know the American movie The Wizard of Oz, but there's this scene where, the wizard finally appears and it turns out that he's being run by somebody behind the curtain. So this is Viktor Orban and his image. And so this is the kind of thing I mean, which is that we're seeing the destruction of constitutional government, kind of regardless of what ideology is being run at the top to kind of befuddle and confuse everybody. Underneath it all, there's this. So how do they get away with it? Well, one of the ways they get away with it is the other kind of backsliding, which is ideological backsliding. So what you'll see is the governments, as they start to deconstruct constitutional government, ramping up their ideological obnoxiousness in order to move the attention away from the structural stuff they're doing to the ideological stuff they're doing. So Viktor Orban has used these campaigns against migrants to whip up fear while he's steadily disrupting the constitutional system. In Poland, there was this absolutely tragic plane crash in 2010 that killed the brother of the current autocratic leader and basically the entire Polish political military elite. That was an investigated and a closed case. It was a pilot trying to land, actually being pressured from inside the plane by people who wanted to get to where they were going in Russia. When this new government came in 2015, they reopened the investigation, and this is this ongoing conspiracy theory that they keep bringing up whenever their constitutional reforms are attacked. What I keep telling my Hungarian friends, because I work, Hungary is sort of my central case where a lot of this stuff got started in, which is my focal case in the book. I keep saying to my friends, whenever the government puts up a statue to a raving anti-Semite, it means you should look at what's going through the parliament that day, right? And instead what happens is the entire liberal opposition goes and protests at the statue and nobody watches the parliament, right? And they've done it over and over again. This was the most obnoxious of the statues. This was the statue to the victims of German occupation. Where to start? All I'll say is that German occupation is a funny way to describe the status of a country that voluntarily aligned itself with Germany. And second of all, the statue to victims of German occupation, which was supposed to include all the Hungarians as well as all the Jews killed in the Holocaust, putting up a Christian, the Archangel Gabriel is not the most appropriate anyway. So this is one of those. But, every time these statues goes up, all the liberal, and you'll see it like it's written in the papers. So every time you see one of those statue stories, just ask yourself what the parliament was doing. All right, so the end result of all of this is that the ideological backsliding is, I think, a cover for this. It's the thing that attracts attention while they're doing this other stuff. And this is where it's important to focus on the other stuff. All right, so constitutions are in trouble. So the question is how these autocrats got there in the first place. What created the opening through which this kind of thing could happen? And this is the standard explanation. Populism. So lots of books, some written by colleagues of mine. And so this is where I want to say, this is the all-purpose explanation, and you probably know the drill, right? So the people are angry, and they are angry because of economic dislocation, fake news, fear of immigrants, angers at old elites, race. The whole literature sort of does this, right? And I'm not saying this isn't happening. I'm just saying I don't think this is the cause of this. The problem begins with elections, but the question is populism really driving this? When you look at surveys, again, surveys are one piece of evidence in this book. They're sort of a quick way of getting a snapshot. What you'll find is that publics that elect the, quote, populists, unquote, are very rarely in favor of crashing constitutional government. So here's just one Pew survey result. This is a survey across a lot of countries where people are asked, is a system where a strong leader can make decisions without interference good or bad? So they try to make it as neutral as possible, like a strong leader can make decisions without interference. And it turns out they don't get majorities almost anywhere for this proposition. I wish they'd done somewhat different countries, but the surveys I've seen in Hungary and Poland, et cetera, there is no support for crashing constitutional government, or there is much less support than you would guess from election results. What you'll get is support for keeping out migrants or, something else. You find that, but not for crashing constitutional government. So I think that and I have a lot more evidence on this stuff, but populism, I think, over-explains what's going on. Instead, experts call what's going on populism after the election's gone wrong. So what I propose to do, and what I'm doing in this section of the book, is to say, in order to figure out whether people are electing populists because they want to crash constitutional democracy, you have to look at what the choices were at the time the autocrat came to power and ask, did the voters vote for toxic policy, or did they vote to upend constitutional government, or did they vote for something else? Are voters actually to blame for all the consequences? So for this, you need to ask, so how should voters vote? And I think what you see in healthy democratic publics is that when one party's been in power a long time, and there's a more or less bipolar system of rotation of power from center left to center right or something of that kind, then after one government's been in power too long, you switch governments, right? And if there's pox on all their houses, then you vote for the new one. That's actually a sign of a robust democratic public, to want to rotate power and to want to try new things if all of the other options have already been tried. And you'd think that when somebody actually advocates crashing a constitutional system, voters should vote against them. So let me give you a couple of examples from the book about why I think populism doesn't explain much. So Viktor Orban is one of my leading autocrats in chief, comes to power in 2010, which is 2 years after the Hungarian government had been bailed out by the IMF because it basically went bankrupt. And there was a caretaker government in place. When you looked at Orban's campaign in 2010, he campaigned against austerity and against corruption, and he never said he was going to change the Constitution, not a word of what came later. And if you look at the other parties, there were the Socialist Party, the lead party in the opposition. By this time, Hungary only had 2 2/2 of parties. So the other main party was the Socialists, on whose watch the economy had collapsed. There was this little group called LMP, which stands for Legitimacy Politica, which means politics can be different, youthful. I've often described them as vaguely green, vaguely youthful, but mostly vague, like nobody had any idea what they stood for. They had no platform. And then there was this neo-Nazi Jobbik. So if you have a choice between Viktor Orban, who had been in power once before and was, sometimes says intemperate things, but had governed before and the country hadn't crashed, the socialists who crashed the economy, a party you'd never heard of, and the neo-Nazis, who would you vote for, right? It's a context like this, I think, that Viktor Orban got elected, and I wouldn't call that a populist vote at the moment that he's elected, right? There's a similar kind of case you can say about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, because by 1998, when he comes to power, all of the mainstream parties had collapsed. In fact, he was the second guy elected with no party behind him and just a social movement. So both the Standard Party of the left and the Standard Party of the right had sort of exhausted themselves. They were barely standing. And so what you were getting were candidates who were at the top of social movements in the absence of parties. And you go back and you read Chavez's speeches before the election. And again, he's campaigning against austerity and for redistribution. He's campaigning against corruption. It's a very traditional campaign. He's a fiery speaker, but he's not promising fiery things in those campaign speeches. And he runs against somebody who's like a non-candidate. I mean, somebody who kind of came out of this social movement and wasn't well known. He did not say he was going to completely renovate the entire government. That only came after the election. And so if you're going to vote in this election between somebody, now, there were danger signals with him. He had tried to topple the government in a coup a decade earlier. But he said, all that is over. I am now a regular politician. And there was no strong opposition to him. Like, nobody running against him was nearly as strong as he was. So if you vote for Chavez, are you voting populist, right? The crucial thing, I think, to look at in these pivotal elections is that very often, and I think this is the Donald Trump story, it's less voters voting for somebody than voting against somebody. And it's very often voting for someone who, even when they look erratic, people are saying after the election they'll be better, or they don't really mean it, or they don't actually even say it. So I think that when you look at those pivotal elections, very often they turn out not to be a populist uprising that's trying to support some radical program. Usually the radical program is not in sight. So the autocrats don't campaign as that. And so what you see are voters rotating power. Very often it was the time for the other party to come in, that the party in power had been there a long time. In a normal democratic system, you would get some rotation. And so what I'm just saying is the danger signals, if you run it back before you know what's going to happen, the danger signals are actually not so clear. So I think what that shows is that voters are not as irresponsible as we say. So then the question is, if they have such bad choices, what's producing the bad choices? And that's where I want to say the problem here is political parties. So if you look around the world, you'll see that established parties are weakening, splintering, battling civil wars. Voters face elections in which they hate all parties. I used to play a game at dinner parties where I'd say, is there any election anywhere in the world where there was some candidate you would have wanted to vote for? And there would be these long silences. And then actually for a while people would say, Angela Merkel, but that's Justin Trudeau. I mean, it's hard, right, to find an election where you really think, you get very excited about somebody, even if it's not your country. And what you see is that this is on the backs of declining support for major parties. So this is a graph. Again, I have this is all piecemeal evidence in the presentation. I have a lot more systematic stuff in the book. This is just one graph that shows you, like all those countries, if you look at the share of the vote going in blue to the mainstream left party and in red going to the mainstream right party, you'll see that both sets of parties are declining. The traditional parties are just undergoing a general loss of support. These are some figures from Europe. On the left, what you see is the percentage of the public that belong to any party, which has also been going down almost everywhere, including in the countries you thought of as relatively robust democracies. And on the right, there's a chart where the blue line shows you, blue line guided off the blue numbers on the left, show you the share of the vote that's gotten by the party that gets the most votes, which is to say that's going down, the parliament's splintering, and the sort of rust-colored arrow that you see there tagged to the numbers on the right show you the number of parties that are getting more than 1% of the vote, averaged over those same countries, right? Oh, this is across Europe, I'm sorry, in parliamentary elections, which is to say we're seeing this fractioning of the political space. In almost all advanced democracies, parties of the left and parties of the right are going down, and you're getting a lot more little parties. So what's going wrong with parties? And again, my central argument here is that rogue leaders can be elected without rogue voters. Normal elections, things that don't look like crisis elections, can bring abnormal results if the party system is broken and voters are given bad choices. Okay, so what goes wrong? So one thing that happens, you see a lot in declining party systems, is they keep recycling the same faces or the same families or the same names. On the right, the French election that brought Macron to power, he was the only new face. The other people had run before, they were very familiar. So you're seeing voters gravitating just toward new faces because old parties recycle people that they've known a long time. Another problem you see is that parties split. And this is the Tory party, how to put it, Brexit is brought to you by a split in the Tory party that they tried to resolve by taking it to a vote. The Republican Party was badly split. The reason why Donald Trump got the nomination was that there were, a dozen more or less normal Republicans and then one who was not normal. And when the 12 split the normal vote and you've got the pure play for abnormal, Trump was winning pluralities but never majorities in the primaries. And this is because you've got a dysfunctional party that can't get some of the mainstream candidates out of the primary race to be able to contest this. Broken parties because you have these internal splits. Party drift. Sometimes you get a party that used to stand for something historically for a long time, and suddenly it stands for something else. And this can work either because you have a relatively good party that goes bad. So Viktor Orban's party was an absolutely normal party for the first 4 elections or so. and had governed once before without catastrophic effects. In Poland, peace had been a disastrous party when it ran before, but when it ran in 2015, it hid all the faces that had been responsible for the early disaster and promised people, we will not be that party, we are now a new party, right? So the party starts to shift and voters don't always understand what that means. One of the big things that happens to parties is that they fail to deliver, and one of the reasons why they fail to deliver is that they make promises. Either they're under an austerity program from which they can't escape, or they make economic promises that can't be kept because they're enmeshed in a global system where national governments don't really have the power to make those promises. So there's disillusionment all around. That's another kind of reason. But I think there's also something else going on here. Why are parties putting up weak candidates? Why are they putting up strange candidates? Why are traditional parties failing? And I think there's a bigger thing, because when you look at the range of countries, just how many countries are going through this, it's got to be something bigger than some national pathology. And what is that? So the old political spectrum, which we've had for 150 to 200 years, I suppose, in which parties are arrayed from left to right, is no longer a very good description of where people's politics are. And a lot of that is because I think the new form of political identification is no longer class-based, partly because what's a class in a digital and transient and global economy isn't quite so clear, but also because identity is other forms of identity are taking precedence over class identity. And what is that identity? Well, it's an identity with either cosmopolitan values. You think you're a citizen of the world, and then it's a good thing that you can travel and speak languages and have a passport and so on, or that trade is a good thing, that international economic interdependence is a good thing. Or your horizon of political concern is your country, your neighborhood, your family, your language not going anywhere because you have everything you need at home. And that axis, which goes from sort of national to cosmopolitan or global to local or something of that kind, is, I think, the new axis of identification. And that axis splits the left and it splits the right. Right? So if you want the left nationalists, see Jeremy Corbyn. If you want the right nationalists, see Viktor Orban. But there's right cosmopolitan, there's left cosmopolitan. So these parties are dividing, and the splits are often happening because left-right isn't the dominant pole of identification. And when you get these party splits, the old parties fall apart, the voters don't really identify with them as much anymore, and you get a political space. This is the Pippa Norris and Ron Engelhardt version. I have some amendments to make to their version, but this is kind of the political space you've got, which is left and right aren't gone, but they've been overlaid by this populism. They call populism, I would call nationalism, to cosmopolitanism. And that political space is not well represented yet by new parties. So as a result, you see voters cycling around trying to look for where they're going to find some combination that they want. And in many national democracies, those parties don't exist yet. So this is what I think is going on, that voters are looking to rotate power. They're looking for new faces. They're not looking, by and large, for people who want to crash the constitutional system. And yes, they may be attracted to toxic messages in general, but the toxic messages are not the same thing as killing off constitutions. So finally, what is to be done? Well, the first thing we have to do, and I've switched my teaching since all of this has started, is to try to learn to spot the autocrat. You have to train people that what they're seeing is not just an ideological difference that will go away with the next election. You have to train people to see that what they're witnessing is the death of a constitutional system. So I think we need to ask whether legal changes that these new autocrats make allow a democracy to remain self-sustaining. And by self-sustaining, I mean that there'll be a next election that's free and fair, that power can rotate over the long haul, that there are enough guardrails on the democracy that there's some difference between the rules of the game and the game, because once the rules of the game become the game, you've lost your constitutional democracy, and that the current majority is not being entrenched for the long haul. We need to restore, I think, or to sort of gain an idea, not just of militant democracy. There's a whole toolbox of that kind of stuff. And these parties try to skirt those restrictions. You know, what we need instead is a kind of militant legality. We have to restore the arguments for why governments need independent judiciaries, independent media, independent civil sectors, independent electoral machinery. In some places, there's so much cynicism that the very idea of independent generates laughs, as if it's impossible. And so restoring why that matters and what it looks like is something that I think also matters. We need to fix the problem with parties, and here I think the German Basic Law gives at least a place to start. So everyone knows Part 2 of Article 21, which is the part that allows party bans. But actually, Part 1 of Article 21, which right at the moment doesn't have a mechanism in Germany to enforce it, strikes me as being, even more interesting in a lot of ways because it's kind of novel. And that is that political parties in Germany are supposed to meet this test, that the internal organization of parties must conform to democratic principles. It turns out, if you look at a lot of these autocrats, the way they behaved in their parties or social movements before they got elected is often a pretty good clue to how they're going to govern, much more than what they say. And I think if we would find some way to be able to enforce, this is hard, you have to operationalize it, figure out what it would mean, what the range of variation is, but I think that's one place to look, that you see the autocrats' trouble by looking at what they've done before. And so, the goal is to get a wiser public that sees what's going on and recognizes the danger and isn't distracted by all the ideological stuff, because ultimately they've got to vote again and they've got to be able to escape this kind of stuff. So how do we prevent a constitution from dying? Save the Constitution campaigns. That sign on the upper right is from a campaign going on in India now, trying to protect some constitutional provisions from the current prime minister, who is, shall we say, no respecter of constitutions. And so having these public campaigns about constitutionalism and saving them is, I think, the only way to go. So thank you. Happy to take questions.
We have some microphones down here if you want to sit, or you can stay at the podium.
How about if I stand, because I can see everybody when I sit.
Sure. And do we have microphones for... Okay. I'll hand this one around. Also, thank you.
I can sit.
Yeah, whatever you want.
Okay, all right, I'll sit.
There was a huge amount on the table there.
There was a whole book, sorry. There's a lot more detail in the book, but that's the overview of the whole argument, so I'd love to get reactions.
Yeah. So I have a series of things that I'd love to put in front of you at some point, but I definitely want to see if we can pull, should we get 3 or so from the floor if we can to start?
It's a lot.
People digest. So, Christine. Yep.
Thank you so much for the great talk. I was wondering how you view the response, actual and potential, of the EU to the developments that have been happening in some of the EU member states. Thank you.
Should I take a couple? Okay.
We have one more here, and then before we take that one, and then there's one there. Okay.
I was just wondering, I guess, about the role of capital and sort of the argument that actually what's happening isn't that it's a divide between global and national, but actually that capitalists have captured the system so that the conversation, maybe, I'm wondering if the divide is different than the one you identify.
Okay, EU capitalism and
I have a short question. If you could maybe comment on the Swiss system, as we here in Switzerland, they have for the last 60, 65 years had more of a consensual approach to the government. They have something they call the magic formula, so that the strongest parties in the parliament are always represented in the government, which means that there's not really this change between different parties or different approaches that you described as being important for a democracy. On the other hand, Switzerland is often seen as the example for working democracy in Europe or in the world. So is this a solution, or is this leading to other problems? On the other hand, we have the strongest party as a right-wing populist nationalist party. here in Switzerland now for 25 years, I think. So there might be some issues with that as well. And I think I have to give you the microphone back now.
I like Switzerland as ideological values versus constitutional values.
Yeah. No, I think that those are great questions. So let me take them in order. So first on the EU, when all this started happening in Hungary, the EU didn't know what it was looking at. And they didn't know what they were looking at because they couldn't imagine that a relatively stable democratic government that had gotten into the EU could ever fall back as far as it did. The second thing was that the way the EU is set up is that there are now elaborate checks to get into the club, all the Copenhagen criteria and so forth. There are no checks once you get in. So the first reaction of the European Commission was to say, we don't have any tools for dealing with this. So it turns out they have tools. They've had to sharpen them, find them, put them together. I think now, or at least under the currently outgoing European Commission, with Franz Timmermans sort of leading the charge from the Commission, they've been pretty effective with Poland. I think they've really actually been able to stop some of the terrible reforms in their tracks. But you can also see that the Commission has kind of given up on Hungary because there's no opposition left. Now Hungary had an election a few weeks ago in which some opposition mayors finally captured some cities, which was like it's the first time you've seen any kind of electoral success in, we have 9 years of this now. So, they've sort of given up having watched it go by. So I think that they're trying to do this now. The European Court of Justice has also been convinced finally that the kind of constitutional devastation that I've been describing is dangerous not just for the countries but also for Europe. So if you have a captured judiciary, as you know, the EU may have a judiciary, but it doesn't, 99%, whoops, I didn't even go there. 99% of EU law cases are decided by national courts. And if a national court gets it wrong, there's no appeal to a European court, right, to correct it. So when you have that system and you've got captured national courts, the ECJ has finally realized that this really threatens the entire project. And you've seen them get very active on these Polish cases. So the EU is swinging around to having slowly something to say about this. But I worry because the incoming commission shows some real signs of weakness, I think, on this. And we also see a number of other countries that are sort of teetering on the edge of, they're just one election away from a real disaster, right? So I'm not sure that Europe has this solved yet, but they've gotten much better. On capitalism, this is really, it's an interesting and complicated question. So let me try to say something simple because we don't have that much time, which is that in a lot of these, in Poland and Hungary, let's take the cases I know best, you can think about those countries as having two separate economies operating in the same space. There's a transnational economy, which is very dependent on the German car industry, and by and large, Kaczynski and Orban have left those alone. That's the goose that lays the golden egg. They're not going to touch it. So international capital has more or less been able to operate without restriction from this system. What you see, though, is that there's a national economy. It's like the cosmopolitan and the national economies, right? There's this national economy which operates in Hungarian, operates in Polish, by and large, doesn't have international customers or suppliers. And that's where the government operates autocratically to kind of squeeze all of those enterprises by threatening them with regulatory measures, with tax investigations, and so on. So international capital, as always, gets kind of a free pass in a lot of these systems. In the places where it hasn't, so if you take some of the left populists that have been much more aggressively challenging international capital, what you find is that the economy crashes. See Venezuela, and so on. So, where international capital is protected, these guys get away with it. And I think they know exactly that that's the third rail, as we say, that you can't really touch. With regard to Switzerland, so this is where I would like to contrast Switzerland and the Netherlands, both of which have kind of consensual governments. Here, of course, there's a collective executive, which is a different kind of thing, but there are coalitions in the Netherlands that always have, sort of most of the major parties kind of repeating. So the good thing about those systems is that you don't have deep conflict built into the party system. The bad thing about those systems is that if voters get discontent, they don't have anywhere to go because they can vote for different parties, but they still wind up with the same government, right? So it seems to me that the difference between the Netherlands and Switzerland is that with all the referenda in Switzerland, there's a place for people to go, which is to say if a particular issue gets hot enough, it can be farmed out to a referendum, and then it breaks through the consensus in a way, with a separate assertion on an individual issue, which doesn't then affect the constitutional structure, right? So individual toxic issues can be spun off that way. In the Netherlands, there's not that possibility because they don't have a referendum culture. So there it's been, the rise of the right has been far more threatening to this system, or the rise of extremist parties, because when people get fed up, the question is, what is their choice? If every party you vote for goes into the government, then what have you done when you switch your vote? So it's this kind of odd combination of consensual government and referendum culture that I think has made Switzerland somewhat less susceptible to this. But every system has its weak spots. And, the weak spot, I think, in consensual governments or in grand coalitions that keep repeating is that voters feel like at election time nothing changes. And if they're discontent, that's not a good thing for a democracy. So that's the worry. Yeah.
So we have Nico at the back and here. Okay, we'll start at the back and then move forwards.
So my question is around actually being able to find an alternative party option that would work and that doesn't actively try to kill the democracy. Yeah. And I will try to ask this from the perspective of India. In the country as big as India, finding a new third party as a viable option would, I think, take many, many years. And so right now the party we have in power, BJP, like you said, the parties sort of drift from their ideology. And if we go back to 1975, when the Congress was in power, Indira Gandhi effectively killed democracy at the time when she, passed the emergency bill. And that time BJP rose back to power on the basis that they were going to do something different. And now they're in power and they're doing something along the same lines. And if the alternative we have is Congress, which maybe starts functioning better, what's the surety that, we don't go back to the same circle eventually?
Yeah. Good question.
Did you have your hand up? No, Nico? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. It was really a fascinating talk and wide-ranging, obviously, sort of, kind of covering lots of issues. I found especially helpful when you came towards the end and tried to describe sort of what are the kind of underlying causes for the decline of the party system, which I think is really central. I mean, I very much like the description of the legalist tools and the autocratic legalism things you've done before, but sort of trying to understand why there is the possibility for these new autocrats to use these tools, to look at the underpinnings of that. Though when you came back to the responses and the solutions, they were again they were legal institutional rather than going to the underpinning social structures. And I wanted to push you a bit on that because in a sense, much of what you talked about, disillusionment, voters being fed up with the existing parties not offering a choice anymore, and you pointed to the fact, well, it can't offer a choice anymore because most of their economic choices especially are taken away because they're integrated into a global economy that constrains them, and in a sense, you can't do anything anymore. In a sense, that would suggest that if you want to recreate choice, you would have to go protectionist and get out of the WTO and simply say, well, we return to a national economic space in which actually you can live out your choices. In a sense, that's what Corbyn, in a sense, tries to gain from getting out of the European Union. Right. I think somewhat mistakenly, but nevertheless, I mean, I think that's, in a sense, that move. Isn't that a logical conclusion, or is there something to avoid it? Do we want to avoid it?
Yeah. Good. Okay. Another good question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I come from Slovakia, and recently we elected Zuzana Čaputová as the president.
Yeah.
Her values kind of gained attraction, and she's very successful. However, the traction she gained doesn't seem to be reflected in the party. So the polls are not, I would say, So it is not really reflected the values that she brought to the game. So do you think there's a difference between presidential elections and the party elections, and to what extent is the risk worth it?
Yeah. So these are great questions. Let me take India and Slovakia before I address the Nico's question on the international, because that's a different dimension. So, because my answer to both India and Slovakia is sort of the same, which is that one of the problems that you see in both these places is a failure of all the parties, you know, where they've all had a turn and they've all been found wanting. And then the public jumps at a new face. I mean, this is now what's happened in Slovakia. It hasn't yet happened in India, but you can imagine this happening. It's a little bit easier in a parliamentary system. You can't get just a new face without a party. But what you see happened, for example, in Venezuela and also in Ecuador, where the parties had collapsed, is that you see a popular face at the top of a social movement, which is even more dangerous, right? Because the social movement is just one figure and acolytes. There's no structure there. So my worry about India is that this is what traditionally happens next. In Slovakia's case, you've got the new face, and it's a you know, Europe has been thrilled, you know, as you know, but there's no party behind it, right? There's no structure. So the question is how you get elections and parties and structures so that people have real choices with real choices of different policies, right? How do we reconstruct the party system? And that's I think the dilemma in both countries, which brings me to Nico Kriš's excellent question. So this is where, and I didn't get to do this here because I'm just thinking about how we do this, but so if a lot of the if a lot of things are no longer under national control, particularly economic policy in countries that are already economically interdependent, then either national elections have to do what they've done, right, which is to move to symbolic issues that can be resolved at national level, right? So people might not have thought the most important problem in Switzerland was minarets, you know, or in Hungary was migrants, because frankly, none of them wanted to stay there, right? So there are these kind of invented national identity problems, which are things that can be debated and done something about at some national level, right? So this suggests that we need an even more fundamental rethink of parties. And we can't even get it in the EU yet, but let's think first about the EU. Why we don't have trans-European parties, given how much is decided at EU level, is of course the great mystery. And you know what we've seen instead is that a European party like the European People's Party hides the fact that Viktor Orban is one of its members. Like, how many people who voted for Angela Merkel in Germany had any clue that they were voting for Viktor Orban at EU level, right? They just don't. European parties don't even have an identity, right? So given how interdependent national governments are, economically in particular, the only way to get an economic dimension back into national elections is to have transnational parties, so that you're voting not just for your own government, but you're voting with a party that's allied with other governments that can actually have some effect in the transnational institutions. So I think this is going to be the future of parties. Now, how we get there from here is a little bit puzzling, but you know, the more interdependent people are, the more policies are being set above national level, the more there has to be some kind of democratic responsiveness put into that system. And what most analysts have focused on is how to make the international organizations more democratic, which is very tough because people have enough trouble keeping track of a national government as opposed to a local one. But the collapse of parties may be the opening for this, right, is to have parties at national level with familiar faces speaking the languages of people who vote for them, who have an alliance with other similar governments at international level. So transnational parties, I think, are the next thing. And if you have some ideas about how to create them, I'd love to hear them.
Can I push you a little bit on
Yeah.
this, though?
Yeah.
So there's a story, you're telling us a story about the political economy of disenchantment.
Yeah.
But there was also a little bit of a story in response to Rebecca's question, I think, about the political economy of constitutional backsliding really specifically, which was that actually it requires this really specific form of a dual economy,
Right.
which is that you have circuits of transnational capital that are integrated and insulated and that can benefit from some of the constitutional protections that you're talking about, while you can squeeze the other bits of the economy.
Yeah.
You don't want the two economies to be too integrated because you squeeze one and the international capital flees.
Yeah.
You also don't want to squeeze the lower end and make everything unstable such that international capital flees. And I'm just wondering, does that really just narrow your universe of cases down to a set of countries that actually, is that a political economic precondition for constitutional backsliding?
My countries are EU countries, right? Which is to say that if these governments moved against transnational capital, they would run afoul of EU rules of the sort the EU has no trouble enforcing. And that's what they were avoiding. So if you look at the Latin American cases that I'm looking at, they don't have those constraints. And in fact, they have gone after international capital. So I think it really depends on what the transnational landscape looks like in the part of the world where these countries are operating. But you know, it's a big three-dimensional puzzle about national governments, the transnational landscape, and then all the other actors in that transnational landscape, including international capital, as well as whatever, you know, governmental forms there may be above the national level. So, you know, at some level, each country has its own particular configuration of these forces. But, you know, and I think what the EU has done is to keep Hungary from becoming Turkey, right? Which is to say, that level of repression and that level of economic collapse is probably not going to happen because Hungary's in the EU. But, you know, these countries like Turkey, like Venezuela, where for a long time they were simply autocratic constitutional spaces, and then the global, you know, the global capital figured it out and fled, and then their economies collapsed, right? So that's one way these things end. And so you can either be controlled by the transnational governance organizations or by the transnational economic, you know, corporations, for example. It would be helpful if those things were integrated into a democratic space where both international capital had some democratic regulatory system at transnational level, and there was some responsiveness of the transnational organizations to national publics, right? So, I mean, I used to think that you could democratize the EU more than we have so far. And what you see is that it's been very difficult for democratic publics in this most transnationally integrated of spaces to understand more than a couple levels up. You know, unless people spend full time thinking about these things, that's way too many levels and way too many levels of accountability to keep straight. So I'm thinking that this move toward transnational parties, where there's coordination of election messages across different democratic spaces, would both anchor the national democratic polities, right? Because if your message is getting coordinated with other countries, that limits how crazy you can get, or sort of non-normative you can get. But it also provides a link up, right? So the moral of the story is, the more I looked into this and looked underneath these cases and just tried to do this granular, detailed thing about what happened in these countries where constitutions have collapsed or are on the verge of collapse, it turns out that parties are the story, right? So that suggests, and you know, at the ending, I didn't get back to the parties loop, but that suggests that rebuilding has also got to be a rebuilding of parties, you know. And I don't know how many of you know the work of Peter Mayer, whose work on parties I think is really visionary, where he shows how he mostly is looking at Europe in the 20th century, parties grow out of social groups, right? They start with ethnic organizations, religious organizations, social groups, and they're really the civil sector organized politically. But, you know, in the last several decades, they've become elements of the state. They're funded by states, they have rules accountable to states. They don't have necessarily I don't want to call it a natural social base, but they don't start from a social base. They start from a set of state rules. And that's been because that was the first stage of hollowing out parties. Now they're adjuncts of the state. So if they're that, then what's the next stage? I think the next stage is you need, again, checks and balances on parties. And one way to provide that is to have these linkages of parties across national spaces that are empowered with a common message to act at transnational level. So, you know, let's try that. I'm just trying to work out what that means, but that's kind of where I think I'm going with the last chapter that's not yet written here.
I think we have time for one more round of questions.
There's a question right there.
And if you just wave at me, I'll add you to the list.
Hello, Professor.
Yeah.
So maybe following up your thread of transnational party,
Yeah.
I was thinking about two examples. One is Hungarian I think it passed a law on prohibiting foreign interference into its NGO and into its, like through the way of NGO into its party. And also Australia has passed similar laws. I was thinking like how this connects or maybe a hindrance to your transnational party theory or ideal.
Yeah, great question.
May I ask the question in regards to the four freedoms?
The EU's four freedoms.
The EU's
rather than
four
Frank
freedoms,
Rosevelt's.
which in a way we could say was very useful for capital to move. While on the union side, any idea of a trans-European labor union doesn't exist.
Right.
And I think as long as we don't have a better match in terms of power between capital and labor, parties are a form of substitute for that. But I think with capital being more dominant, it can more easily, let's say, co-opt the political parties.
Right.
So if you agree with my suggestion that we need to balance power a little bit, maybe labor union could be one of it, but to have anything that's trans-European, I don't know how to think of it and how to create that.
Yeah. So both of these, they're great questions. Oh, sorry.
You have one more?
One more. Yeah.
No, be a second.
Yeah. Ah.
It's
Hi. Right there.
Thank you very much for your very provocative presentation. I'm very struck by the focus on political parties and on contemporary, the slide you had on the alignments from left, right to local, cosmopolitan, picked up from Engelhardt and
I can
Tippenoris.
put it back up.
Made me think, and also your comments about transnationalism. Where does a party, or where do the Greens come into this? Because in recent elections, we've seen the emergence of Green parties, and you haven't referred to them at any. Do you think there's room and space here in your description of this emerging political realignment?
Yeah, that's great. Actually, these three questions go really well together because, you know, the NGO sector. So if you take Peter Mayer's history of political parties, he says they start with what we would now call NGOs. They weren't called that then, right? But they were various local associations of people of common interests. They grow out of that. They grow out of unions, actually, as well. And then they become more bureaucratized and become more part of the state apparatus. So that's sort of the history that Mayer traces. So one of the things it suggests is that if parties are now adjuncts of the state, right, if they're sufficiently regulated that they become like another branch of government, so to speak, then it suggests that, because again, checked power is always a good thing, you don't want only parties to be the links across countries that hold democratic governments in check, right? So it suggests that transnational NGOs, it suggests that transnational labor organizations are really important to also try to encourage, right? And so then the question is, how do you do that? So, you know, there have been transnational unions, and there certainly are international NGOs, right? The thing to do is not to just develop another parallel transnationalism, right? But to think about, how to put it, to think about sort of parallel models of organizations that can coordinate across national boundaries. Because again, you don't, I mean, anyway, but I think that that's another axis of kind of civil sector engagement, so that the parties don't become the monopoly on what social organization looks like, right? So I guess I would be in favor of trying to think about both. Now, you know, it's kind of surprising in the EU with its labor protections in EU law that there isn't a better encouragement of a labor voice in, you know, either at EU level or even in the coordination across national levels, right? And I think that would be really, I mean, you have to think about what the organization of that would look like, but it seems to me that in some sense, capital and transnational organizations have outstripped all of the methods through which citizens with less power have been able to challenge them, right? So if you want checked power, including at transnational level, you need to start organizing across these levels, and that's why autocratic governments try to cut off the flow of foreign funds. So, you know, Hungary's done it, Russia's done it, Israel just did it as their government's been coming in for more international criticism. And with regard to labor, you know, dividing and conquering has always been the strategy of everyone who can do that. So, you know, both of these would be other important vectors, I think, to kind of encourage more civil sector participation. And Tom, I'm going to forget your question. I know I was going to forget one of them. Oh, about the Greens, yeah. So here, that's actually a really interesting. So the Greens are one of the parties that grew out of a social movement, right? Later than the other parties grew out of social movements. And so for a long time, it's had a kind of transnational social movement base. I think one of the reasons why it's growing is that the question is, what does left cosmopolitanism look like, right? If left nationalism looks like Jeremy Corbyn, then left cosmopolitanism looks like the Greens. And part of it is that they start with an issue that doesn't stop at national borders. And then they've expanded a political program around that to sort of think again about what cosmopolitan coordination would look like if you had a basically left agenda. And it's not surprising that that's replacing, and a lot, it was Germany's the lead case, but there are others too. When you saw how the Greens did in the European elections this last time, they're replacing the old social democratic parties, which once had a base in labor unions and other social organizations that are now weakening. Right, so that's exactly the kind of organic growth of parties that we should see. And not surprisingly, the Greens are one of the more coherent party organizations at European level, because they really do have a coordinated message across different national spaces. So that could be the model for what a new party looks like. You know, I might say, though, that it's not just limited to the Greens, right? And actually, it was interesting. I was predicting, and I'm glad I'm wrong, that you'd see the so-called sort of right-wing populist forces actually unite in a common European party. I really thought that Salvini and Le Pen and Orban and Kaczynski and all of them would wind up going into a common formation, and it turns out the thing about nationalism is that, I mean, how to put it, everybody may have a similar shaped theory, but they don't match each other very well. And so that coalition fell apart, which was really interesting. And I hate to say it, but once you start doing this, of course, it's going to encourage the cooperation also on the right across, you know, on the far right across different political spaces as well. But the Greens might be a good model for this precisely because their core platform is a transnational platform. And they've been pretty coherent about message. If they grow, if they spread, if they get more support, they're likely to become a bigger tent party, and then it becomes harder to do the transnational coordination. But thank you for mentioning the Greens. I should have said that right away.
I think we may actually be out of time, unfortunately. Although I do just want to thank you for ending on a note that was neither wildly optimistic nor wildly pessimistic, which tends to have been the way in which we've oscillated in this series of talks. Otherwise, it's nice to end on a practical, clear-headed, and analytically really sharp point for a talk that had all those same qualities. So with that, I just want to thank you for your talk.
Thank you. Hard work ahead for everybody.